So we were just talking about the sensitivities surrounding China, the post-war Chinese drive to commemorate the Chinese struggle against Japan, not just here in Southeast Asia, Singapore, Malaya, but also, and in some senses, primarily in China itself.
Yes.
And this issue, of course, is very much bound up with the post-war tensions between the Chinese here in Malaya, Singapore, Southeast Asia, the Malays, the Indian community, which bubbled over into armed conflict, of course, in the late 40s and 50s. So here in this space, we don't just have this imperial monument, we have a monument to the ethnic Indian soldiers who fought in the Indian National Army for Japan against the British. We have a monument to Lim Bo Seng, who we'll say a bit about in a second, and we have a monument to the anti-communist struggle in the post-war period. So can you tell us a bit about the story of those monuments?
Yeah, it's really quite an interesting combination, because you ask yourself, how does this all fit together? But if we think about it, I think we can conceptualize it as different layers of memorial space coming together in this very park at different points in time. So you mentioned the Indian National Army monument, or rather the new memorial that was built on its remnants that we now find just a few steps from the Cenotaph. And the memorial itself that stands now in its place was built in the 1990s, basically in the context of the 50th anniversary of the end of World War II.
That's right.
And it is part of a larger batch of memorials that the National Heritage Board erected all across the island. So over a dozen memorials were erected to commemorate different stops, different events in the Singaporean story of the Second World War. For example, where the Japanese landed, where, for instance, at Changi Beach, where many civilians were killed by the Japanese. But also, quite interestingly, they commemorate the Indian National Army, which was, those who were joining the Indian National Army during wartime would have been considered traitors by the British, because what happened after the fall of Singapore, most of the white servicemen from Australia, from Britain, for example, were interned for the remainder of the war, perhaps even channeled to work on the death railway in Thailand or in Burma. But the Indians were offered a different choice. So since the Japanese still had in mind to create some form of Asia for the Asians, of course, under Japanese leadership.
Yes, they were claiming to be liberators.
Exactly. Yeah. They wanted to be seen as such, and they had to make good on their promise as well. So what they did is they offered the Indian soldiers who had served for the British a choice. Why don't you join, for instance, the struggle, our struggle against freeing Asia from British imperialism?
And unsurprisingly, if you go to the Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo, the museum there makes great play of the Indian National Army. And
I think the fact that the Indian National Army and a lot of these other batches of monuments came up in the 1990s is also interesting, because we've already seen at the Civilian War Memorial how the way in which the war is used in the state's agenda is really to try to bring all the different peoples together. Right. And for a long time, it was very much about playing down the different sensitivities with regards to ethnicity, because the Japanese treated the different groups differently.
That's right.
They were really harsh on the Chinese, and we've spoken a little bit about the Sukching. And for the Malays, it was really very much about trying to win over their hearts and minds and try to promote Malay nationalism within the country, Malaya at that point in time. And for the Indians as well, it was very much about trying to get them over to the Japanese side in trying to build this greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere as well.
Exactly.
So it's for a long time you didn't have that monument come up, but by the 1990s, I think, because a lot of time has passed on, probably means that people are a lot more comfortable talking about a lot of these sensitive things, and it also gives the impression that that is able to cover all these different controversial issues.
It's also interesting, I think, that the Singaporean government by the 1990s is quite happy to commemorate, or seemingly happy to commemorate, local Indians' contribution to the Indian national struggle against Japan. So this is an Indian struggle, not a Singaporean or Malayan one.
Not really.
rather less happy to commemorate the Chinese struggle on behalf of China against Japan.
No, that's right. Yeah.
Why is that?
Well, you could say that it also has certain communist connotations, perhaps, in the post-war period don't sit too well with the government of Singapore. And if we look at the anti-communist memorial right over here, we do get a sense that the period from 1948 to 1989 is now being framed as the continuation of a certain historical reference point, a certain struggle for the post-war generation that they had to go through in order to make Singapore into what it is today, a anti-fascist, anti-communist state. But I think the anti-communist memorial over here also holds potentially different connotations, because we have to probably think about when it was actually erected.